Newark at 350, Settlement, Growth, Renewal. Since Robert Treat stepped ashore with his fellow Puritans 350 years ago, Newark has gone through many changes. For the first century of its existence, Newark was primarily a religious settlement. Its inhabitants focused on a life lived according to the dictates of their faith. After the Revolutionary War, however, the tiny settlement exploded. In the 50 years after 1785, the population of Newark increased from just 1,000 to more than 16,000. New roads, the Morris Canal, and early railroads were all built through Newark, making it an important commercial center. Newark in the 19th century was an industrial powerhouse. From early industries like leatherworking and shoes, it expanded into beer, silver and jewelry, chemicals, electricity, and many others. It attracted inventors and entrepreneurs like Seth Boyden, Thomas Edison, Peter Ballantine, and Edward Weston. Along with industry came immigrants, mostly from Europe. Italians and Irish and Germans and others arrived in the 19th century, seeking work in the city's many factories. By 1910, 70% of Newarkers were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Just as the European immigration wave began to abate, another group of migrants started arriving. African Americans from the rural South, fleeing repressive Jim Crow laws, began settling in Newark around the time of World War I. By the mid-1960s, Newark was a majority black city. Unfortunately, these newcomers arrived just as the industrial city began deindustrializing. Wealthy factory owners started moving to the suburbs in the 1920s, and the Depression brought further stress to the industrial base. After World War II, middle-class residents of Newark joined a nationwide movement to the suburbs. Many of the city's businesses moved to lower-tax locales. In the 1950s, Newark attempted to remake itself through urban renewal, condemning and bulldozing wide swaths of the city, then replacing what was lost with high-rise, subsidized housing. As in other cities where this approach was tried, these high-rises proved to be unmanageable magnets for drugs and crime. They were eventually razed. The events of July 1967 had a profound effect on life in Newark. The civil unrest led to millions of dollars in property damage and the deaths of 26 people, but it also helped elect the city's first African-American mayor and propel a civic activism that continues today. In the decades since, Newark has tried to overcome the legacy of 1967. Every large residential or commercial development is portrayed as one more step in the rebirth of Newark, part of the Renaissance heralded by city leaders. As Newark celebrates its 350th anniversary, we take a look back at the entire 350 years since the founding, and we look to the future as Newark seems yet again on the cusp of great things. Hi, my name is Tom Ankner. I'm a librarian in the Charles F. Cummings, New Jersey Information Center at the Newark Public Library. Today I'll be taking you on a little tour of my exhibit, Newark at 350, Settlement, Growth, Renewal, marking Newark's 350th anniversary. Newark was founded by 300 Puritan settlers from Connecticut who landed on the shores of the Passaic in May 1666. They were seeking a place where they could live according to the dictates of their religion. The settlement grew slowly during most of the 18th century, with the population reaching maybe 1,000 by the time of the American Revolution. By the 1720s, the crude early housing of the founding generation had given way to more permanent structures built of local stone, like the Plume House, which still stands on Broad Street. What started as a religious settlement for a specific sect had begun to diversify with the introduction of an Episcopal congregation in the 1740s. With the construction of roads and ferries to present-day Jersey City in the 1760s, Newark became an important marketplace and stagecoach stop. George Washington's troops, in retreat from the British in New York, passed through Newark in the fall of 1776. In the decades after the Revolutionary War, growth accelerated. The population of Newark more than quadrupled to 4,500 by the end of the 18th century, then reached 6,000 in 1810 and more than 16,000 by the 1830s. Newark was starting to become an important commercial center. In the 1790s, bridges were built over the Passaic and Hackensack rivers, replacing ferries. It is now easier than ever to get to New York City. The population continued to grow even as portions of the city began to break away. Newark originally comprised most of what is now Essex County. Beginning in the 1790s, parts of the city broke away to form separate towns. Caldwell was formed in 1798, Orange in 1806, and Bloomfield in 1812. Other areas followed. The 1790s saw the beginnings of large-scale industry in Newark. A merchant named Moses Combs began exporting shoes to the southern states, inaugurating a practice followed by other Newark industrialists. By the 1830s, Newark had grown to the point that a change in government was needed. With the arrival of the railroads and the Morris Canal, Newark's importance as a commercial center increased. The simple town meeting was no longer sufficient. In 1836, voters overwhelmingly chose to incorporate as a city with an elected mayor and aldermen. The new elected government was able to set up Newark's first police force, establish a permanent meeting place in the new Essex County Courthouse, and establish a central marketplace. The city continued to grow. By the outbreak of civil war in 1861, the population stood at more than 70,000 and accounted for 1 of every 10 New Jersey residents. After Newark was incorporated as a city in 1836, one of the things they did was establish public schools. The Newark High School was established in 1838, one of the oldest public high schools in the country. Newark High School it still exists today. It was renamed Barringer High School in the early 20th century. Newark sold many of its manufactured goods in the southern states, so the increase of hostilities between North and South was felt keenly here. Abraham Lincoln lost among voters in Newark in the 1860 election. A newspaper, the Newark Daily Journal, vociferously opposed Lincoln throughout the war. After the Civil War, Newark was poised for great things. By 1872, Newark ranked 3rd of all U.S. cities in industrial output. Its population had ballooned to 115,000, composed of large numbers of European immigrants looking for work in its many factories. A wide range of goods was produced here, leather goods and hats and beer and jewelry, just a few of the items known to be made in the city on the Passaic. While Newark continued to grow, it failed to grow as quickly as manufacturing cities further west, like Cleveland and Detroit, which both surpassed Newark in population by the end of the century. A realization took hold that Newark could not rely entirely on manufacturing in the economic sphere, and soon expanded in banking, insurance, and education. After the turn of the 20th century, the steady flow of immigrants increased. Beginning around the time of World War I, these immigrants were joined by large numbers of African Americans leaving the rural South for jobs in northern industrial cities like Newark. Efforts to beautify the city and add cultural and entertainment options were taking place. The Essex County Parks System, established in 1895, operated both Branch Brook and Wequahic parks. Theaters and department stores made the city a shopping and entertainment center. The Newark Public Library, which opened a new building on Washington Park in 1901, became a leading cultural force under director John Cotton Dana, who also founded the Newark Museum. Coinciding with the influx of immigrants and African Americans was the start of another demographic shift in Newark. Commuter railroads and the automobile were making it possible for the owners of Newark's factories to live elsewhere. Many of these industrialists were buying homes in suburbs like Montclair, where lot sizes were larger and the air and streets were cleaner. This shift was making itself felt in the city in subtle ways in the 1920s. Property values were decreasing, and business leaders had less of a vested interest in the quality of city life. The Prohibition era also marked a deepening of the influence of organized crime in Newark, and the Great Depression of the 1930s marked the first decade in Newark's history in which the population declined. Much of Newark's massive manufacturing capacity was dedicated to wartime goods during World War II. With factories hiring, the city's population partly rebounded during the 1940s. As elsewhere in the country, with so many men away at war, job opportunities for women increased. The war years proved to be a temporary reprieve for Newark. The problems that existed before the war, government corruption, organized crime, a fleeing business class, remained. Making matters worse was the trend toward suburbanization, aided by lower taxes in the suburbs and housing loan policies that discouraged the buying of homes in cities. By the mid-1950s, businesses and middle-class residents were fleeing the city. In an attempt to stem the flow, the city changed its form of government for the second time in less than 40 years. In 1954, Newark initiated the system currently in use, a popularly elected mayor and 9 council members elected from 5 wards. It was during this period that Newark began clearing wide swaths of downtown land for the construction of large public housing projects. Under Louis Danzig, executive director of the Newark Housing Authority, Newark built more units of public housing per capita than any other city in the country. Today, the 1960s are remembered in Newark primarily as the time of the riots, but there were other things happening in Newark as well. Both President John F. Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. visited during the decade. Newark celebrated its 300th anniversary. Arising from the civil unrest of 1967, the African American community and the city as a whole found an activist voice that prevails to this day. Sometimes referred to as the riots, sometimes as the rebellion, sometimes simply as civil unrest, the events of July 1967 had a profound impact on the city of Newark. 26 people were killed, $10 million in property damage resulted, but also resulting from the riots was the election of Newark's first black mayor 3 years later, Kenneth Gibson. Newark emerged from the civil disorder of 1967 scarred and traumatized, but the city moved forward. The age of Sharp James began in 1986 when he defeated Kenneth Gibson to become mayor. His 20 years in office were marked by relentless boosterism and increased development. As in other cities around the country, high-rise public housing constructed in mid-century was torn down and replaced by townhouse-style dwellings. Newark emerged from the Sharp James years with a new, young, media-conscious mayor named Cory Booker. During Booker's 7 years in office, the city saw construction of the Prudential Center Arena, an increase in investment downtown, and the controversial donation of $200 million to the Newark schools. Booker moved on to the United States Senate in 2013. The current Newark mayor, Ras Baraka, has made a strong impression with his efforts to cut crime in the city and return the schools to local control. The Newark Public Library is an excellent place to do research on the history of the city of Newark. The Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center on the library's third floor is one of the premier collections of New Jersey-related materials in the state. Our focus is Newark and Essex County.